The fabric of the empty chair across from her was a deep, unforgiving crimson. Alara stared at it, the velvet seeming to absorb all the light and sound in the opulent restaurant. One moment, Mark was there, all cheap cologne and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The next, he was gone, a muttered excuse about a forgotten wallet dissolving into the ambient clatter of silver on porcelain. He was not coming back. She knew it with the same cold certainty she felt when a patient's pulse vanished beneath her fingertips. She had $4 in the pocket of her light blue scrubs. 4 crumpled singles, meant for a tip on a coffee she had hoped he would buy. Now, they were all she had to her name, and a heavy, leather-bound bill sat on the white tablecloth like a death sentence. The waiter, a man with a face carved from disapproval, had already begun to orbit their table. However, it was not the waiter's gaze she felt. It was the man at the table to her left. He had not moved for an hour, a statue in a suit so dark it seemed to drink the candlelight. Now, she felt the weight of his attention, a physical pressure against her skin. She made the mistake of looking. He was not staring, not even looking directly at her. His head was angled toward the man speaking to him in a low, urgent tone. But she knew. In this world of quiet power and old money, a world she had only entered for a single, disastrous night, she was a discordant note. And he had heard it. The silence at her table stretched, becoming thin and sharp. Alara's mind raced, a frantic triage of terrible options. She could try to run. She could plead. She could offer to wash dishes, a humiliating scene from a movie she never wanted to star in. Her hands, usually so steady when inserting in 4 or dressing a wound, trembled in her lap. The $4 felt like useless paper. The waiter was approaching, his path deliberate, his expression final. She braced herself for the impact of shame. But he never reached her. A shadow fell over the table. The man from the next table was standing beside her. He was taller than she had expected, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, filling the space with an absolute and effortless authority. He placed a hand on the back of the empty chair, his fingers long and elegant. A heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger caught the light. It was the only piece of jewelry he wore. He did not look at her. He looked at the waiter. A glance so brief and dismissive it was an insult in itself. "Put this on my account," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble with a gravelly edge, the sound of stones settling deep underground. It was not a request. The waiter, who had been seconds from evicting her, froze. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, crossed his features. He gave a short, jerky nod and retreated without a word. The man finally turned his gaze on Alara. His eyes were the color of dark roast coffee, so dark the pupil was nearly lost. They held no warmth, no pity. They were analytical, assessing. He was taking her apart piece by piece, cataloging her worn-out running shoes beneath the table, the faint exhaustion under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. "Thank you," she managed, her voice tight. "I don't know how I can repay you." A corner of his mouth twitched, a motion so small it could not be called a smile. "Oh, I think you do," he said, the quiet certainty in his tone sending a chill down her spine. "Nothing is free. You owe me a debt." He gestured to the door. "Walk with me."
She should have said no.
She should have stayed in her seat and taken her chances with the manager, with the police, with anyone but this man whose stillness was more menacing than any threat. But his command wrapped around her, pulling her to her feet. It felt inevitable, like gravity. She followed him through the maze of tables, his presence parting the crowd like a ship's prow through water. The air outside was cold, a shock of reality after the restaurant's gilded cage. The city sounds of New York rushed in, sirens and horns and the distant hum of a million lives she was no longer a part of. He led her toward a black sedan parked at the curb, the engine purring softly. A driver stood by the open rear door. This was it. This was the moment she was supposed to get in, to be taken somewhere, to pay a price she could not begin to imagine. That was when the world exploded in a screech of tires and a series of sharp, cracking sounds that were not backfires. People on the sidewalk screamed and scattered. Alera's training slammed into place, her mind instantly shifting from fear to function. Gunshots. 3 of them. Her eyes scanned the chaos, identifying threats, looking for cover. The man beside her, Enzo, the name his associate had whispered inside, moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. He had a gun in his hand as if it had materialized from the air itself, his body a shield in front of hers, pushing her back against the cold brick of the restaurant. Another car, a dark SUV, sped away from the opposite curb, its tires smoking. In its wake, a man lay on the pavement. He was one of Enzo's, the man who had been speaking to him at the table. He was clutching his abdomen, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his white shirt. Enzo's men were moving, shouting, securing the scene with brutal efficiency. But they were soldiers, not medics. They were creating a perimeter, not stopping the bleeding. Alera saw it all in a clinical flash. Arterial bleed. He had maybe 2 minutes. "I need to get to him," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the noise. Enzo glanced down at her, his dark eyes narrowed in surprise. "Stay here. You are safe." "He's not," she shot back, pushing against his arm. "He's bleeding out. I'm a nurse. Let me help him." For a heartbeat, he hesitated. He looked from her determined face to his fallen man, and a decision was made. He gave a sharp nod. "Luca," he barked to the driver. With her. She did not wait for another invitation. She ran Luca at her side, her mind a checklist of procedures. Pressure. Find the entry and exit wounds. Keep him conscious. She knelt in the street, the rough asphalt scraping her knees through her scrubs. The man's eyes were wide with shock and pain. "Hey," she said, her voice calm and even, the voice she used in the ER when the world was ending for someone. "My name is Alera. I'm going to help you. What's your name?" "Paolo," he gasped, his hand slipping from the wound. She pressed down hard with both hands, ignoring his cry of pain. "Stay with me, Paolo." She looked up at Luca. "Your belt."
Now.
Luca unbuckled his belt without question and handed it to her. She worked quickly, her fingers sure and steady, fashioning a makeshift pressure dressing, her mind blessedly blank of everything but the task at hand. The feel of the warm, sticky blood soaking through her scrubs did not faze her. She had seen worse. But she had never done it on a public street, surrounded by men with guns, under the watchful, unreadable gaze of a Mafia boss to whom she now owed a debt. By saving his man, she had done more than just her job. She had seen his face in the middle of an assassination attempt. She had seen his organization in action. She had made herself a witness. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would not be letting her go. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The black sedan moved with a silent, predatory smoothness through the sleeping streets of Brooklyn. Alera sat stiffly in the back, the scent of antiseptic from her hasty cleanup clinging to her alongside the faint, metallic tang of Paolo's blood. Enzo sat beside her, though he kept a careful distance. He had not spoken a word since bundling her into the car after the paramedics, summoned by a discreet call from one of his men, had taken Paolo away. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and unvoiced threats. She stared out the window at the rows of brownstones, their windows dark. Her own small apartment felt a world away, a life that belonged to someone else. She should be terrified. A part of her was a cold knot of dread sitting low in her stomach. But another part, the part that had taken over on the sidewalk, was strangely calm. It was the calm of the emergency room, the detached focus that came when survival was the only thing that mattered. The car turned into a narrow alley and stopped before a nondescript steel door. Luca, the driver, got out and opened it, revealing a dimly lit concrete garage. He drove the car inside, and the door rolled shut behind them, sealing them in. The finality of the sound echoed in the enclosed space. Enzo finally moved, turning to face her. In the dim light, his face was all sharp angles and deep shadows. "You have good hands," he stated. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, like a mechanic noting the quality of a tool. "I'm an ER nurse," she said, her voice flat. I know, he replied, and the simple words sent a fresh wave of cold through her. He knew. Of course he knew. He had probably known who she was before he even stood up from his table. The blind date, Mark's sudden disappearance, it all started to feel less like random misfortune and more like a series of calculated moves on a board she hadn't even known she was playing on. He led her from the garage up a flight of stairs into a spacious, sparsely furnished apartment. It was clean, anonymous, a safe house. It smelled of lemon polish and old coffee. Another man, older, with a weary face and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, was waiting for them. He nodded at Enzo.
Johnny.
Any word on Paolo? Enzo asked, his voice stripped of all emotion. He's stable. The doctors said whoever packed the wound on site saved his life. Another minute. Johnny let the sentence hang in the air. He glanced at Alara, his eyes lingering on the bloodstains on her scrubs. Enzo's gaze followed Johnny's. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond cold assessment in his eyes. It was not gratitude. It was something more complex, something that felt like possession. She had not just witnessed his world. She had intervened. She had become a part of the equation. Get her a room, Enzo ordered Johnny. And find her something else to wear, he turned back to Alara. You will stay here tonight. Again, it was not a request. Johnny led her down a hallway to a small, Spartan bedroom. A bed, a dresser, a single window with a view of a brick wall. He left and returned a few moments later with a plain gray sweatshirt and sweatpants. The bathroom is across the hall, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Get some rest. She showered in a daze, the hot water stinging her scraped knees. As she washed Paolo's blood from her skin, she felt the last vestiges of her old life circling the drain with it. Dressed in the anonymous gray clothes, she felt like a prisoner, stripped of her identity. Her scrubs, her uniform were gone. Alara the nurse was gone. Only Alara, the woman who owed Enzo Moretti a debt, remained. She lay on the bed, but did not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway, every distant siren, made her flinch. Sometime in the deep of the night, she heard voices from the main room. Enzo's low rumble and Johnny's weary response. She could not make out the words, but the tone was tense. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cool wood floor, and crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. Falcone's work. No question, Johnny was saying. The message is clear. They know we're moving on the docks. They made a mistake coming at me in public. Enzo's voice was like ice. And they made a bigger mistake leaving a survivor. There was a pause. Then Johnny's voice, lower now. What about the girl? She saw everything. The girl is an asset, Enzo replied, and the word hung in the air, cold and sharp. She saved Paolo's life. She showed composure. She is useful. Useful witnesses are still witnesses, Enzo. It's a complication. It is a complication I will handle, Enzo said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. My father, he trusted everyone. He brought in men who smiled to his face and put a knife in his back. My brother paid the price for that trust. I do not make the same mistake. I trust no one. But I know value when I see it. The mention of his brother was a crack in the frozen surface, a glimpse of the wound beneath. A failure he still carried. A death he blamed on misplaced trust. And now she was here, a stranger, a complication he intended to handle. Alara backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She was not a person to him. She was an asset.
A tool.
Something to be used. She looked around the small room at the window. It was her only way out. She could try to run, to disappear into the city and hope he wouldn't find her. It was a slim chance, but it was a chance. She walked to the window and slowly, quietly, tried the latch. It was unlocked. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in her chest. She could slip out, drop into the alley and run. She could go to the police. She could leave this nightmare behind. She put one hand on the windowsill, ready to push it open. But then she stopped. She thought of Paolo, lying in a hospital bed. She thought of the calm, efficient way she had saved his life. And she thought of Enzo's voice, the raw edge of pain when he spoke of his brother. Running meant looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. It meant living in fear. Staying was a different kind of fear, but it was a known quantity. Here, in this room, she knew who the monster was. Out there, she would be alone. She made a choice. It was not a choice for him, or for them. It was a choice for herself. She would not run. She would face this. She walked out of the bedroom and down the hall. Enzo and Johnny stopped talking and looked up as she entered the living room. Their faces were hard, guarded. "I need to check his dressing in the morning," she said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. She was not talking about Paolo. She was talking about the wound she had tended to in the alley, the one that tied her to this world now. She was claiming her place, her utility. Enzo watched her, his dark eyes searching her face. He was looking for fear, for duplicity. He was looking for a reason not to trust her. Whatever he saw, or didn't see, made him give a slow, deliberate nod. "Johnny," he said, his eyes still locked on hers. "Get her a proper medical kit."
He said her name then.
Alara, it was the first time he had said it since the restaurant. It sounded different now. Not a name, but a title, a position. He had seen her choice, the moment she walked back into the room instead of out the window. And in his world, a choice like that was a bond, as unbreakable as any oath. The debt she owed him had just changed. It was no longer about a restaurant bill. It was about loyalty, and the price of that was infinitely higher. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of tense stillness. Alara existed in the strange, suspended reality of the safe house. Johnny treated her with a gruff, paternal distance, bringing her food and the promised medical kit, which was better stocked than her station in the ER. Luca, the driver, would nod at her whenever he saw her, a silent acknowledgement of the life she had helped save. And Enzo was a constant, brooding presence. He was either on the phone, speaking in low, rapid Italian that she did not understand, or sitting in a leather armchair, staring at nothing, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He watched her. She felt his gaze when she was cleaning and redressing the superficial cut on her own arm from the chaos outside the restaurant. She felt it when she methodically organized the medical kit, laying out gauze, antiseptic, and sutures with practiced efficiency. He said nothing, but his observation was a weight, a constant pressure. He was studying her, learning the way she moved, the way she thought. On the second night, Johnny brought in a man she recognized from the news.
Mark.
Her disastrous blind date. He was not smiling now. His face was pale with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. Two of Enzo's men held him between them, his feet dragging on the floor. They threw him into a wooden chair in the center of the room. He was talking to a detective, Johnny reported to Enzo, feeding them information about shipments. He was wearing a wire when he met the girl. The plan was to get her out of the restaurant and into a car. A kidnapping. Leverage against you. Enzo's face was a mask of cold fury. He circled Mark slowly, like a shark circling its prey. "The Falcone family pays you to be a rat," Mark stammered, denying everything, the lies clumsy and transparent. Alara watched from the doorway of the kitchen, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She had been bait, a pawn in a game so far above her head she couldn't even see the board. Enzo's patience snapped. He backhanded Mark across the face, a single, precise motion that cracked like a whip in the silent room. Mark cried out, blood trickling from his lip. "I will ask you one more time," Enzo said, his voice dangerously soft. "Who is your contact in the Falcone family?" Mark just sobbed, shaking his head. Enzo sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He nodded to Johnny, who produced a pair of pliers from his pocket. Alara's stomach turned. She was a healer. Her entire being was programmed to prevent pain, to mend what was broken. She could not watch this. But running would show weakness. So she stayed. And then she saw it. A faint, telltale tremor in Mark's left hand. A slight discoloration of his nail beds. She had seen it before in the ER. She stepped forward. Stop. Every man in the room froze and looked at her. Enzo turned, one eyebrow raised in a silent, lethal question. That won't work, she said, her voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. She pointed at Mark. He has a heart condition, Raynaud syndrome, and a ventricular septal defect he's had since birth. I saw it on his hospital intake form 6 months ago when he came in for a panic attack. She looked directly at Mark, whose eyes were now wide with a new kind of fear. Extreme stress, like, say, having your fingers broken, could trigger a cardiac event. You could have a massive heart attack right here on the floor. And I'm the only one here who knows how to use a defibrillator. She paused, letting the words sink in. But I might not be in the mood to help. She had crossed a line. She knew it. She was using her medical knowledge not to heal, but as a weapon. She was leveraging a man's life, his fear of death, to get what Enzo wanted. It was a morally gray, terrifying act, and it felt more natural than she wanted to admit. The silence in the room was absolute. Mark stared at her, his face ashen. He believed her. Enzo looked from her to Mark, and then back to her. The cold fury in his eyes was replaced by something else, something sharp and appreciative. He saw what she had done. She had not used violence. She had used information. It was surgical. It was his language. Tell me the name, Enzo said to Mark, his voice calm again. Mark broke. The name tumbled from his bloody lips. Sal Falcone. It's Salvatore Falcone. His youngest son. Enzo nodded. He gestured to his men, who hauled Mark out of the room. He was a problem to be disposed of elsewhere. When they were gone, it was just Enzo and Alero in the room. The air between them crackled with a new, dangerous energy. You see things other people don't, he said, his voice a low murmur. He took a step closer to her. He smelled of cedar and something else, something like cold night air. That makes you useful. And it makes you dangerous. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. I could say the same about you. The admission hung between them, a confession of a different sort. It was not about attraction. It was about recognition. He saw the steel in her, and she saw the man beneath the monster. They were two sides of the same coin, survivors who used the tools they had been given. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed the shell of her ear, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching gentleness. It was more intimate than a kiss. The moment was shattered by the shrill ring of a burner phone Johnny had left on the table. Enzo's hand dropped. He answered it, listening for a moment before his entire body went rigid. When he bit out, he listened again. I understand. He hung up. The look on his face was grim. That was my contact at the hospital. Sal Falcone just tried to get Paolo's room number. When he was refused, he told the desk nurse to give you a message. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark with a storm she knew was about to break. He said he knows you're with me, and that a debt is owed for the man you saved. He intends to collect. The threat was no longer just against him. It was against her. They had targeted her personally. She was no longer just a witness or an asset. She was the target. But as the fear washed over her, something else rose to meet it. A cold, hard anger. They thought she was a weakness. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Enzo saw it in her eyes. He saw the nurse recede and the survivor take her place. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw something that looked almost like a smile touch his lips. It did not reach his eyes, but it was there. It was the smile of a predator who had just found a partner for the hunt. The attack came just before dawn. Not a frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious infiltration. Alero was woken by the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen, followed by a muffled curse. The safe house, their sanctuary, had been breached. Instantly, she was on her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her system. She heard Johnny shout a warning from the living room, followed by the deafening roar of a shotgun blast. The fight was on. Her room was at the back of the apartment, down a long, narrow hallway. It was a death trap. She couldn't stay there. But running into the main room was suicide. Her mind, trained for rapid assessment in chaotic ERs, scanned her surroundings for options. There was nothing. A bed, a dresser, the window with its view of a brick wall. Then her eyes landed on the medical kit Enzo had given her. And under the sink in her small, private bathroom, she remembered seeing cleaning supplies. Ammonia. Bleach. An idea, reckless and terrible, sparked in her mind. She grabbed the bottles, her hands moving with purpose. She knew the chemical reaction was volatile, that it would create a cloud of chloramine gas. It was toxic. It was dangerous. It was perfect. She heard footsteps pounding down the hall toward her room. 2 of them, maybe 3. They were coming to corner her, to take the leverage they thought she was. She had seconds. She barricaded the door with the dresser, the heavy wood scraping against the floor. It wouldn't hold them for long, but she didn't need long. She uncapped the bottles, her nurse's knowledge of dosage and chemical interactions twisting into something destructive. She poured the liquids into the toilet bowl. The reaction was immediate, a sickening hiss as a thick, white gas began to rise, acrid and choking. They started kicking the door. The wood splintered. She grabbed the bedsheet, soaked it in the sink, and wrapped it around her face, creating a makeshift filter. The door burst open, and 3 men in dark tactical gear spilled into the room, guns raised. They saw her, a small figure silhouetted against the bathroom light. They started to move toward her, but then the gas hit them. The first man choked, his eyes streaming. The second doubled over, gasping for air, his gun clattering to the floor. The narrow hallway had funneled them in, and now the small room had become a gas chamber. Her diversion had worked. Through the chaos, she heard more shots from the living room, Enzo's men pushing back. This was her chance. She scrambled into the bathroom, slammed the door, and locked it. She shoved a towel under the crack to slow the gas from seeping in and threw open the small bathroom window. It was a tight squeeze, but it led out onto a fire escape. Cold air hit her face as she climbed out onto the rusty metal platform. Below her, the alley was filled with dark figures and the glint of steel. She couldn't go down. She went up. She scrambled up the fire escape, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. When she reached the roof, she saw him. Enzo. He was there, locked in a brutal fight with a man twice his size. Sal Falcone. He was younger than Enzo, built like a linebacker, and he fought with a wild, desperate rage. Enzo was more precise, his movements economical and lethal, but Sal had the weight and the fury. He slammed Enzo against the brick parapet of the roof, and Enzo's gun went skittering across the tar paper. Sal's hands went to Enzo's throat, squeezing, his face contorted in a triumphant snarl. Alara didn't think. She acted. She looked around, and her eyes found a loose piece of rebar lying near some construction debris. She grabbed it, the rusty metal heavy and cold in her hands, and she ran. She brought the bar down on the back of Sal's knee with all the force she could muster. There was a sickening crunch, and he roared in pain, his grip on Enzo's throat loosening. Enzo gasped for air, shoving Sal back. He stumbled, his leg giving way, and looked at Alara with shocked, hate-filled eyes. That was all the time Enzo needed. He moved like a viper, closing the distance and driving a short, wicked-looking knife into Sal's side. Sal grunted, his eyes wide with disbelief, and collapsed to the roof. The sudden silence was deafening. The sounds of the fight below had died down. It was over. Alara stood there, panting, the rebar still clutched in her hand. Enzo was leaning against the parapet, taking deep, ragged breaths, his eyes fixed on her. He looked at the rebar, then at her face. He saw no fear. He saw no regret. He saw a partner. He walked over to her and gently took the rebar from her hand, letting it drop to the roof with a clang. He looked at the cut on her arm, the one she had gotten outside the restaurant, which had reopened in the scramble. Without a word, he tore a strip of fabric from the bottom of his own shirt and carefully, gently, wrapped it around her forearm, his touch surprisingly tender. "You belong here," he said, his voice raw. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. An acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. A cost had been paid. The safe house was gone. Her old life was a ghost. Men were dead on the roof and in the apartment below. She could never go back. She knew that. But as she looked at Enzo, at the man who saw her not as a liability to be protected but as a weapon to be valued, she realized she didn't want to. Days later, they stood in a penthouse apartment high above the city. The view was breathtaking, the lights of Manhattan a glittering tapestry spread out below them. The space was vast, modern, and sterile, smelling of fresh paint and new money. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress in the sky. It was safe.
For now.
Enzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city he was fighting to control. He was dressed in a fresh suit, the picture of untouchable power, but she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She walked to stand beside him, the silence between them no longer heavy with threat, but filled with a quiet understanding. They had been forged into something new in the fire of that dawn raid. He did not look at her, but he turned his hand, palm up, and rested it on the cool glass of the window between them. It was not a command. It was not a demand. It was an offer. A question asked without words. "Here is my world. Here is my hand. Will you take it?" She looked at his hand. She saw the gold signet ring, a symbol of his family, his history. She saw the faint scars on his knuckles, evidence of the violence that was his birthright. And she saw the space he had left for her. She could walk away. He would let her. He would give her money, a new life somewhere far away, and she would be safe. But she would be alone, always looking over her shoulder, a ghost of the woman she had become.
Or she could stay.
She could be more than a nurse, more than a witness, more than an asset. She could be a queen in this brutal, violent kingdom. After a long moment, a silence that held the weight of her entire future, she lifted her own hand. She placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip. It was not gentle. It was not romantic.
It was a pact.
A silent oath made of blood and survival, taken in a glass tower, high above the sleeping city. The choice was made, and she did not regret it.